Contemporary creativity has as much to do with ways of working as the objects that result. And you've often stated that the studio is very much at the heart of your business, of the Amberg Studio. And I was hoping that you could talk a bit about that in terms of its physical environment, but also the metaphorical that that statement implies.
Well, I think starting out making things has been quite influential on how I set up the studio. I set up the studio in 1984 in London, but the ideas originally were driven by a lot of reading from Sori Nagi, the Japanese designer, who wrote a beautiful book called The Unknown Craftsman. I don't know whether anybody's read it, but it's about how the process of making is really, really important and part of the process of designing. And through making, you improve and you extrapolate the design idea through the actual physical act of making it. And that's very, very important. So when we set up the studio, we had this idea of making the workshop central to the studio. So the designers and the craftsmen have to work hand in hand. That becomes any design idea, if they're designed on paper and then on the screen, then goes into a collaboration between the craftsman and the designer. And they have to start developing and building on the original idea simply by making and remaking and making and remaking. And the original concept may, change completely from where you start from, simply by the physical act of making it. And I think it's quite, for me, it's really important. I mean, it's not just about simply sending something down the line to a factory to get it made. You need a workshop based around the designers so that they're constantly in touch and constantly working together. So.
But you actually have the heart of the studio. I don't know how many of you have had the luxury and opportunity to visit Bill in Queen's Park, but the studio really is physically at the centre.
Yeah, physically it's important. Yeah, I think for designers to, as soon as you put makers behind designers, you lose that link. And we set up the studio so that the makers are right in the middle of the work, right in the middle of the building. So every designer, whatever they're doing, if they're going to make a cup of tea, they're going to walk past somebody making something in leather. And that is really important, and that's crucial to the way it works. So even if you're not actually particularly involved on any given job, the act of seeing it around, and you can't avoid it. You have to see people making things all the time. And that's I think it kind of twists the way designers work, it twists the way designers think, it changes how you work on a screen. If right next to you there's somebody physically making something, if you separate those two elements, it becomes a different environment altogether. It's really important.
So you've made reference to all these various peoples, all these skill sets that you have in the studio. Could you elaborate a bit more on the people that you work with in the studio?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that I was very lucky. I didn't go to university, which I think has been a big help. I think it saved me from having to get bogged down in too much, this is right and this is wrong. As you alluded to, I had parents who were very, even though I wasn't going to university, they never for 1 minute said that it was a disaster. They just felt, okay, just go and keep making stuff and keep designing stuff and we'll be all right. And I think that helped me when I was kind of working as an apprentice, because the person who I worked under, this lady Gay Wilson, who was fantastic, really encouraged me to experiment on all levels of leather and really got me passionate about the material, which I think is so crucial. But also there were no boundaries as to what you could do with the material, so there was no sense of, this is how you do it as a saddler, and this is how you do it as a bookbinder. And so when the studio started to evolve properly, as it is now, I would say, and you can see to a certain degree what we've got here. We've got bookbinders, case makers, shoemakers, saddlers. They all come from different elements and they bring different techniques. And their mashing up of all these different ideas make any idea possible. and break down the barriers of the right and the wrong, and there's the process, because everybody brings their own skills and passions to it from their own, and they can weave their own path through design ideas.
So moving on from the physical of the studio to the physical of the material, you have an encyclopedic knowledge of leather, and I'm not going to pretend that I can compete in terms of a conversation about tools, processes and techniques in leather. But perhaps we can talk about, for me, and certainly to make it a good way into it, talk about how you source your leathers, where they come from, the importance of the differentiation between certain, the shoulder, the various different elements of leather.
Well, I think leather's a curious one, because even though it's everywhere, most people's understanding or view of leather is from inside of a car or some hideous sofa. And yet the variety of the material is immense, and not only in terms of the scale of the skin that you want to deal with, so whether it's a bull hide to buffalo to a lamb, you've got exactly the same thing on a smaller leather. So which piece of the skin do you want to use? These are all, a shoulder, which is this piece that we use for the shard, has got graining on it. It's got natural grain in it. It's the cut of the skin that's just off the back of the animal's neck. It's got the most grain. It's got the most character. I think it's gorgeous. And when you use it like wood, you're playing with grain. You're not over-pigmenting the material with a plastic paint finish. You leave it with an aniline finish, so you've got plenty of depth of colour, but you're not trying to disguise any of the character of the skin. There are tanneries all over the world that are producing an enormous variety of material, and because leather in itself is a byproduct, you end up with tanneries specialising in material, especially the tanneries that I go to. We probably use...
To attract byproduct of the animal industry or the meat industry.
Yeah, it's the eating. I mean, as soon as people stop eating meat, the leather industry is going to collapse, that's for sure. And as a consequence of that, you have specialists according to what we eat. So the best calf tanners are in France because they eat so much veal. The best heavy leather tanners are in England and Northern Europe because we eat so much beef. And same with goat and lamb in southwest France and northern Spain, because that's what they eat. And consequently, you have specialist tanners there who are brilliant at that particular tannage and that particular skin type. And the smaller tanners, not these massive commercial tanners who are making car seats and awful dross, they're making things that are really interesting as a material. And those infect and inflect everything that you do, because that becomes the kind of tools and things that you're working with, and what you can, kind of again weave into any design.